Um, I'm going to speak in English or something that echoes English. So I hope some of the idea get through my language, and the images make the rest. The presentation I'm going to share with you, it's like two sets of ideas to start a really bigger project of interpretation of a single object, a classical object of the pre-Columbian art history, and also is part of the process of the curatorial work for a future exhibition on the presence of the bird-eye view in Peruvian art and architecture history. Sorry, un ratito. And with this presentation, I want to echo some of the ideas of some that we've been working on from several years in the Modeling the World group, the PUCP, and the questions about how we make architecture, but also about how we make an image of architecture, of an image of the world, and how we are some kind of species that constantly make things to with our hands and with the size of in a which we need to construct not only models but realities, or in a human scale, whatever a human scale can be it to control it, be it to produce it, or be it to just have the pleasure of these kind of objects. The questioning of this talk is more to focus on how this kind of process of control, miniaturization, or object production process has been driven in the history of architecture. Clearly, architecture has a very close and very strong relationship, especially with drawing. Drawing has maybe has been the space when I say drawing, I think drawing as drawing, perspective, geometry, and science and mathematics, which has been, I think, the most powerful technical and theoretical tool by which architecture has been developed, and the instruments architects have developed to control the process of making architecture, be it in the descriptive geometry, projective geometry. And this is a process of precision. It's always been the creation of ways of making things precise, when the idea of dimension, I think, how to translate dimension in many formats, be it 2D, 3D, or digital space, it's the main focus on this relationship with drawing, geometry, and mathematics, which is the control the process of all these formats to make let's say, to make an idea transforming in something real or material in which we can live in. And in this sense, we have developed the drawing, and even in the late 20th century, this idea of drawing as an instrument of controlling any form, that drawing is also an ability, a capacity that every architect must develop. I think this, I don't know if it's a joke, an exercise, but I think it's an actual true great exercise by Enrique Miralles, in which we expose to a non-architectural object or a non-obviously architectural object like a croissant, and the exercise challenges the ability of the student of an architect to control it geometrically by drawing, which would be the same process that architects carry out every time we make a set of plans, not only to control the form for us, but also to communicate this control to a construction. And I think this, in a very simplistic way, is the process of drawing science, control, and inform the construction, is the process that led us to this new world of the digital model, which is basically a huge amount of information gathered in virtual space, and truly a truly amazing tool, which also make us that has and with a great transformation. I think it's the same process that led from drawing, geometric, projection, and digital. I think it's the same process of trying to control the processes, but with a plus of that digital models can be transformed. You can ask the digital model to react to it. You can make a model in which how the sun is going to touch it, how it's going to be the cost of a building, even now with some software you can model the actual movement of people or cars. So the idea of I don't know if the predictions and communicate in the digital space, it's been a long history, I think, in architectural that comes to drawing and geometry and mathematics. And I think it's a space in which we are now as practitioners, and that's a huge space to still think in. But I also think that very simplistically, in some ways, I'm not quite, but it's like the reality of the profession. No, we are in this process. We all have to enter to BIM and see how all the information that engineers, architects gather in the same archive. No, but I want more to focus more on how the culture of model have changed in the space of architecture, and because I think it's been a really shift in the way architects or in general creators or artists have dealt with the models and the use of the model. And some of the idea I'm going to say now, I think, relate of what we were talking about the Mariana and Nicolas presentation, and because I think the 19th century saw the birth of this kind of models, which are related to, obviously, to pedagogía. I don't know the word, how the way we are educated, how developed spatial capabilities, not only for architects or creators, but for every one of us. No, there is a idea of a human being can be or must be educated in, for example, mathematical or spatial capabilities through models, and this is the classic Freiberg project, which is told that that writes what one of the key architects that explicitly talk about the impact of Froebel's pieces in his own idea of architecture. And this way that this is this is the way in a model acts or interacts with that. No? I think that is also a model, a dynamic one, but in a certain way is a, sorry, I wanted to say that this for artists or architects establish a new way to relate to models or physical objects. And I would say it is also maybe the question or the possibility is that, or the idea would be that there is a way to think through objects, you know, or to produce some, not only to construct, in this case, spatial capabilities, but also to, let's say, to think through objects, you know, that objects that are going to become models or maquettes in a more classical way. And this is something that I think was well established in architectural education too, you know, in the way that composition or free composition, even geometrical or non-geometrical, that was part of a really strong revolution in the way architects educated from the beginning of the 20th century and all the way to the 20th century and the 21st century. And I think that that relation with objects has changed completely in the way we understand what is a model and what is a model for. You know? It's obvious that for instance, the architectons of Malevich, they seem to be close to buildings, but they're really not buildings. They are not supposed to be buildings, but they are supposed to free us to think of buildings. So they are supposed to free us from a certain inertia. I don't know if we say inertia in English. For example, the inertia of the inertia of the repetition of previous architectural forms or systems. No? So what is the purpose of a model? No? It's to free us, is to find an idea, is to train it in the thinking through with hands and bodies. And now this is just a caricatura contemporary that now we can make it for fetishist architects. You can even play with it now. But and they tried, and this is a process that I think we can trace in the 20th century. This idea that thinking not only through makings, but through making and finding objects, find the ideas in objects, and with the actual difficulties of how I can translate this into building. But that's something that technology has solved for some architects, like Frank Gehry's in this case. Now we know that from these scratch objects, Frank Gehry, with this very sophisticated software, can digitalize these, make a 3D model, and in that process, control it in the terms of drawing, and then produce full-scale construction plans. So this was one of the pioneers. Maybe, I don't know if but I just wanted to say that focus on this and this way of relate to models in the way that we do something with matter, and then we build up an idea. Maybe the Gehry's process is too direct, and we actually live like, and he actually many times proposes to inhabit gigantic objects, which is not always, I would say, architectural, when he decides to make a pass through larga vistas or make a piece of architecture. But that's another problem. And in that sense, I wanted to share this project also in the Biennale, also in Chicago, this exhibition by Fujimoto architects, which is called Architecture is Everywhere, in which his office suggests that his office put in front of us these little objects with little people and suggest the architectural possibilities of these things. And differently from Gary, that I would say will go directly from the potato chips to the building, I would say that Fujimoto architects is more in the sense of what we were talking before about the training and of thinking with the eyes and with the hands and be ready to capture architectural ideas or architectural possibilities literally everywhere. No, but and then the question will raise is what goes from these objects to the actual building? No, what make Frank Gehry so directly? What is the process that makes un cenicero, an ash tray, goes from put upside down an ashtray? What makes that go to a building? What is that Fujimoto saw on that object that made possible to think as an architectural idea, no? Or and what make this object models? No, it's only the idea of the miniature of the people put inside, or it's more the idea that it's behind the object. And I would say this idea, and I love the concept of the storytelling that Mariana said, because I actually believe that many of these ideas are not necessarily geometrical traces, but some ideas that we can say with words. I don't know if that comes to full stories, but I think that these objects can be kept as something useful for a project many times in a word translation. No? In this sense, that in thinking in what goes from one object to another, I put this object in front of you, which is an Inca vessel, an Inca paccha, which is an object supposed to be that can be full of drink, of water, of an alcohol, and actually you can drink from it, or you can pour the liquid inside this piece into earth, we suppose in religious or ritual events. But this ceramic object is been read for every scholar as the representation of the cancha, which is a typical organizational structure in Inca architecture. No? What we see at the left side is a reproduction of the ceramic object in Cecilia Puga's exhibition, because it's an object that has caught the imagination of many architects. And what makes me think about this is how, if this ceramic object is really the model of a cancha, what makes the transformation? What makes a typical square and four architectural four rooms structure transform in a rectangular, irregular, five rooms structure? What makes one the same as the other? It's what makes the similarity? What makes what makes one the miniature or the synthesis of the other? And And maybe it's more, I don't know if it's the word is structural, literary, or topological structure. Maybe it's what makes one goes to another is the idea of an enclosed space by the wall, some and some rooms, independent rooms, those salas to the wall, and with important thing that left the angles in with free space. No, I don't know if that's the way it goes, but it could be a way to say that one is a representation of the other. And more directly, this is the drawing by Chilean architects Smila and Radic, in which the project is called a corral, in which he explicitly said in one conversation with him in Lima that this project was 100% based on that ceramic object. So for him, this is the next step to that project, in which we see that the emphasis is not only on the wall and the angles and the voids, but it also has an adaptation to a site. And it also has translated in his words the materiality of the object, not only the topological structure, if you can say, of that ceramic vessel, but also the softness of his own materiality, which relates in depth of its architecture in this constantly movement of this surrounding wall, which make us think to the final idea, because I think we don't know how to deal with this kind of object in pre-Columbian, with the kind of representation of architecture in pre-Columbian culture. This is moche. This is a one and only object, I must say, but this is the object that in a certain way relates to physical materials and the combination of what we actually divide, we actually separate clearly, which is the 2D representation of something and the 3D representation of something. This is clearly a 2D, 3D object in which the view from the above is imposed to every side of this of this almost parallelepipedal object, in which we can always think if this is also an orthographic projection. What makes this artist think that a rectangular six-sided object was ideal to the representation of such a complex as a waka, in this case, as suggested by Canciani, waka, the representation of Waka de la Luna, because it's the left object is probably represent a waka similar to the object we see on the right side. What makes this almost orthographic desafío of the left object? What makes this? Why make that? And what can tell that about architecture or architectural representation? And this is why I suggest this other kind of object, but in which, if you center in the there is a of this object that I have worked in 2 years, some years ago, in which what we saw in the base is actually what we see from the above is like the valley, But this ceramic had flattened it and put it almost like in a 2D representation in front of us. So we have the frontal view of the mountain and the view from the above, from the out of the valley, as a little bit like we can, if we compare this, is like given this. And this is all I have to share with you, which are basically some idea of the how we make objects, and the question of what goes from one object to the object, besides the miniature of dimension. I think that's a question that for me is interesting, because I think maybe on that way is more possible to enter this pre-Columbian object from a very Western point of view, at least in the history of representation. And also, like I was saying at the beginning, because I'm trying, the hypothesis in a way is that is to study the importance of the view from the above in general in the pre-Columbian culture, what can make in the same space Nazca Line, Pitillacta site, Chanquillo site, and maybe these two pre-Columbian objects, another contemporary art production in which, like Gaston Garreau or Jorge Eduardo Eggleston paintings. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. I think it's a very interesting point, or a possible discussion that we could also have about the difference between the model being an abstraction in a kind of typological world, where dimension maybe has more of a protagonism, than the model in a more topological, as you said, worldview, where the things that define the model or the abstraction are less bound to, let's say typological categories, right? It's more the certain functions or certain numbers that define a topological construction of, in this case, Incan architecture or pre-Columbian architecture. So I think that's one very interesting, say, point that you make, or a suggestion that the model can operate not so much as a fidedigno, as a through verisimilitude, of dimensions, but through a kind of topological resonance, between the object that is being represented and the object that is the real object, say. And I also wonder to what extent the kind of point of view that a certain territory imposes on the human being, and I'm thinking specifically about what the Andes produces as a way of looking down upon an object, even though you're on the ground, let's say, produces as let's say, a backdrop for the type of representation that you're alluding to, versus, a very flat form of territory giving way to more perspectival drawings or more geometric models, let's say. Maybe that's forcing a relationship that is not as linear, but I think it's still interesting to bring it back to a kind of territorial configuration that give rise to certain modes of representation. But I'm sure you've touched upon several topics that I think are worth digging into. So I'm sure others have more lucid things to say. Nicolás.
Yes, thank you, Paulo, for the presentation. I was just thinking, because I don't know much about. Can you hear me? Right? Yeah. Okay. I was thinking when you showed one of the vases, one of the first vases you showed, and then you had an image of Cecilia Puga's model at the Biennale. And I cannot stop wondering what knowledge we might be losing when we translate this object to an object that stops having different functions, like, for example, the capacity to hold a liquid, or how one would interact with that model physically. And if that interaction or that capacity of the object to contain something else and to drink it, or I don't know, whatever part of a ritual it might form part of, was intrinsic to the model making itself. I don't know more about it, but maybe you can explain a bit more. What do we know about this object?
Yes, I have presented three basic objects that we know very little about them, especially the last two objects, because they are part of, and even the picture, but because there are objects that there are no records of the context of the finding of these objects. So really this exterior, very formal approach of mine, it's very personal, but it's what can I make what I am interested in making. Especially this vase, I think it's quite interesting what you are saying, because there are no literature about specific if the rectangular form, for instance, has some there is a reason for that form in relation with the function of the liquid. No, I haven't found anything that goes that way. No, that what make the precision of that specific object. No, what make them take this kind of decisions. But there is very interesting what you are saying between the difference of that object with Cecilia Pugas of the Biennale, because both are ceramics objects. Hear me? Sorry, I mean. Because in that moment it started the strong differences. 13 in scale. The first one is something that you can easily grasp it with one hand, even two hands. Two hands is even too much, no? Cecilia's is about 60 centimeters. It has been put in a way in which you have a really close on top. From above you can see it, but it's basically easy for you to go like it is a building, no? There is always the suggestion that you can make a building with that, no? Which make a really completely different object, no? Which is what interested me of what we architects make with objects from that we take from one time, one use, one cultural context, and then in a way becomes a trigger for thinking, or a trigger for design, no? But yes, we have a really depth, a strong depth with thinking objects in Peruvian history. We know very little about some classical objects, because these two objects, the Pacha and the first complex object, it's a very famous, so are very famous, but we know very little about them, very, very little.
But for example, do you think that, I don't know a lot, but I'm aware, for example, that quipus are objects that cannot be understood outside the performance of the object. Do you think there is also some similarity in these objects as part of a ritual that brought sense to them, or not really?
No, I think definitely that would bring another, a completely different approach to the object, definitely. But in relation to quipus, which is the very few remaining quipu traditions, not in Peru, but north in, I don't remember the country. To make quipu, you not only need to perform it, but you, now this group, it's necessary another people in front of you, because the notes are not so universal. There is a history that you are telling while noting the threads that someone has to be listened to. Someone has to listen the history while you are noting the thread. That is a contemporary use of quipu. We don't know if that was the case in Precambrian times, but this performative condition, no, of the transmission of something that is supposed to be universal language, no, I think it's very compelling in terms of what makes the translation from one object to other. And in that sense, obviously there is a chain that maybe is forever broken, but maybe there is as you were saying, introducing time in performative way, also introducing the word to say an object, no, which can be that translates from one object to other, no, a history, a word, a synthesis, not necessarily in geometry lines, which is one way of make something with an object, but with a story. But yes, definitely we lack of many information with that, because that object, we don't know because even this idea that it's a paccha is only by similarity. We really don't know if that object was used as a paccha. It's right. But thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment or ask Paulo any questions?
Faire une remarque au sujet en fait des techniques. Je parle en français. Au sujet des techniques de maquette écrasable que Paulo a montré pour produire des formes qui doivent être scannées par l'informatique, sinon elles sont impossibles à caractériser, elles n'ont pas de géométrie. Moi, ça me fait juste penser à une chose, c'est que c'est Borges qui citait un poète allemand, un anonyme allemand, comme il disait, dans ses dialogues sur la littérature, et qui disait que la rose géante est terrifiante et que la rose n'a pas de pourquoi. Et on a un peu, enfin, moi j'ai ce sentiment-là de se dire que une petite chose, donc une maquette, dans le cas ici présent, une maquette chiffonnée, on va appeler ça, puisse être habitée à grande échelle. Et en fait, ne devient-elle pas, pour sa part, en version géante, comme pratique, une certaine horreur comme ça. Ça produit quelque chose de terrifiant. Et ça me fait penser à une chose, c'est que si on prend un plan structure qui, par itération, est fabriqué petit à petit, à partir de volumes simples au départ, de géométrie simple, et une fois qu'on lui ajoute toute une série d'éléments nécessaires à l'édifice, de la petite chose à la grande chose, la forme devient complexe et dépasse notre imaginaire direct. Donc, notre capacité mentale à la concevoir. Et donc, je pense que c'est ça qu'on cherche. Et aussi, c'est ça qu'ils cherchent dans ces maquettes-là, donc les petites maquettes écrasées, c'est de découvrir des formes qui dépassent notre imaginaire. Et ce que je pense, c'est que un bâtiment, j'appelle ça un bâtiment structure, ou même d'autres modes de production de forme des édifices, suffisent à dépasser ce que l'on en l'augure que l'on s'en formait. Je pense que le remplacer par un écrasement aléatoire, je ne sais pas à quel moment ça rencontre véritablement la question de l'architecture. Voilà, c'est juste une remarque sur ce point-là.
I just wanted to say that I agree in the case of Gary, for instance, no? That I think that at least it poses a strong question. No, what makes that almost arbitrary decision is that really make architecture? No, but every time I have put this question with students, I also put I always put the example of the pyramids, because the pyramids are really a gigantic object. It's really difficult to say that it's structurally architectural. It's geometrical, and we have been educated to think that geometry is architecture. So if you agree that geometry is architecture, every gigantic geometrical object is architecture, but that is very dubious. No, it's not really strong as an argument. Obviously, maybe there is a difference between a pyramid and Gehry, but or maybe that would help us to see other geometrical gigantic objects in Roman architecture, maybe less close to Alberti and more close to Frank Gehry, in the way that is a gigantic object, a gigantic inhabited object, and not structurally in the tradition of the construction of space, as architectural tradition may say. No, but thank you for the comment.
Clotilde, you had a question, I think? Yes. You're muted. Yeah.
Oui, Paulo, je peux te poser une question en français? Oui.
Oui, bien sûr.
Super.
Because on voit que le péruvien parle français aussi, même si on parle en anglais.
Ok. Ouais. En fait, j'avais deux questions sur les maquettes que tu nous as montrées. Peut-être la première, celle qui me semble la plus, enfin en tout cas moi qui m'intéresse le plus, c'est la première Botella que tu as montrée, Botella Moche, où il y a des petites constructions au-dessus. Donc c'est une sorte de cube avec des petites constructions au-dessus. Et contrairement à la deuxième que tu as montrée, j'ai l'impression que celle-là, en fait, ce qui se trouve sur les faces, ça ne fonctionne que si on retourne la bouteille. Tu vois, alors que dans la deuxième, on sent que la bouteille fait une sorte de topographie très verticale et on grimpe dessus. Mais dans la première, c'est comme si la bouteille permettait d'avoir plusieurs maquettes avec chaque fois sur une face. Je m'explique, c'est qu'il y avait deux faces, on voyait deux faces, parce qu'on les voyait presque en axonométrie. Il y en avait une où il y avait une sorte de maison en bas, et sur l'autre, on dirait presque des greniers, comme il y a dans Puruchuco, tu sais, on dirait des greniers. Mais ça marche que ces greniers, ils marchent que s'ils sont à l'horizontale. Et donc, en fait, tout à coup, la bouteille permet d'avoir des maquettes dans les 3 dimensions, dans les 3 directions. Et elles cohabitent parce qu'après, il y a les chemins qui font des continuités. Et donc, on est presque dans quelque chose de... c'est une espèce de concentré d'une série de maquettes qui cohabitent dans 3 directions différentes. Et alors, en plus, l'autre face, après, tu as tourné la maquette. Et sur l'autre face où il n'y a pas de construction, on a des lignes de beige, rouge qui s'alternent. Et là, du coup, ça renvoie aussi presque aux andenes, tu vois, au fait qu'on géométrise le paysage comme ça. Et donc, j'ai l'impression que sur cette bouteille, on concentre toute une série de dispositifs architecturaux et on peut le faire que parce qu'on est sur une bouteille. Parce que ça marche, parce qu'en fait, on a tout d'un coup une on a tout d'un coup une volumétrie capable, quoi. Ah, voilà, tu m'as déjà montré cette bouteille et ça m'avait jamais sauté aux yeux. Et là, tout à coup, ça me frappe. Et alors, l'autre truc, mais ça me semble moins intéressant, mais ça m'a quand même aussi sauté aux yeux. Tu nous montres la petite vaisselle qui fait comment ça s'appelle? Une cancha où on boit dedans. Et puis après, il y a le modèle en 3D d'une vraie cancha où les maisons sont chaque fois au milieu des coins. Et donc, je me demandais, est-ce que ces maquettes, elles ne sont pas aussi là pour questionner ou pour remettre en question les modèles dans lesquels on habite? Tu vois, parce que c'est bizarre quand même qu'il y ait 5 maisons sur le bord et pas 4, alors que dans toutes les canchas, il y en a 4. Et du coup, est-ce que le fait de faire des modèles et de contrôler, comme tu disais, de contrôler tout d'un coup la fabrique de ce qui nous entoure, ça ne permet pas de questionner, de mettre à l'épreuve nos habitats par des petits changements qui changent tout? Et on peut le faire parce qu'en fait, ça n'a aucune implication sur notre habitation quotidienne puisque c'est dans une maquette. Donc, on le tient dans une maquette, on tient nos questions et nos doutes dans des maquettes. C'est des réflexions.
Ce sont des réflexions que j'apprécie, mais surtout j'adore. J'adore. Et non, l'idée du vase cancha, j'aime bien prendre ce sujet dans les coricancha, il existait, parce qu'il n'y a pas tous les restes, mais il existait une cancha à 6, et que peut-être cet objet à 5 objets, peut-être un des objets doit être divisé en deux par le dispositif pour voir. Peut-être. Mais je trouve très intéressant ce que tu dis à partir de cette vase, mais qui peut servir à tout le modèle, non? Que c'est un espace pour à la fois mettre en question, non? Et aussi, ça permet aussi de mettre à l'épreuve quelle est la structure qui soutient les deux objets, non? Et aussi les conditions de fabrication d'un objet céramique et les conditions de construction de l'espace, des méthodes constructives, de l'expérience, pas des mains, mais des corps dans l'architecture, non? Qui produisent d'autres relations. Et je trouvais très intéressant aussi le commentaire du premier objet. L'objet complexe, que j'ai montré dans d'autres présentations, mais juste une fois, mais je n'ai jamais commenté beaucoup de l'objet parce que c'était surtout les montagnes. Les montagnes où on voit la vallée mise à plat, oui, je pense que c'est c'est une hypothèse, c'est un processus même de l'architecture d'une frontalisation de beaucoup d'objets dans les contextes moche et du nord. Il y a presque une situation de vision fixe. Mais le premier objet, ça fait partie d'une période où, je ne l'ai pas dit à la présentation, mais cette bouteille, on le sait, il a une anse qui permet vraiment, et normalement, ces vases à la base sont plutôt ronds, et les hypothèses sont que la perception de ce type d'objet, c'est de prendre la lance et pouvoir faire les tours, non? Et c'est très intéressant ce que tu dises, parce que c'est un objet qui permet de faire les tours, mais surtout permet de faire le poc. Même pour le lire, mais aussi pour le construire, non? Je me mets ça à la place de comment est-ce que tu fais l'objet, non? Chaque fois, l'objet est mis à plat, non? Pour construire chacun de ses faces, non? Cet objet, c'est l'objet peut-être dont on a parlé le plus de modèles. On n'a pas parlé vraiment beaucoup parce qu'on ne connaît pas l'objet, le contexte. mais il y en a au moins 4 articles. Surtout, ils se sont concentrés pour imaginer quelle architecture apparaît si on lit l'objet. Et peut-être le plus intéressant, même si c'est très très court, c'est celui de José Canciani, dans lequel il propose l'hypothèse de que c'est une représentation d'un site spécifique, c'est Huaca de la Luna. Non? Et il y a une comparaison. Donc, je trouvais très intéressant cette modification. Et il y a aussi une chose importante, cet objet, c'est un objet unique. On n'a pas 2 ou 3, c'est un objet. Donc, peut-être c'est un objet associé à un artiste assez unique aussi, ou particulier. Non? Les montagnes, on a au moins une vingtaine. Mais cet objet, c'est unique. C'est unique. Donc, peut-être...
Le fait que ce soit une bouteille ou un vase n'est absolument pas saisi dans vos explications. Ça pourrait être... il faut pas parce que ce soit creux, ça on peut comprendre, ça pourrait être une économie de matière, que sais-je. Ça ne doit pas nécessairement être plein, mais il y a quand même l'élément qui permet de verser ou de déverser quelque chose dedans et qui, dans les explications, les interprétations que tu donnes, Cécile, et toi, Paulo, voilà, ça reste une énigme. Pourquoi?
Non, I have erased all that kind of interpretation of the object because that's a structural and maybe I have to say that in pre-Columbia and northern Peru, the vase and the bottles are the main support for representation. No? And one hypothesis, at least that we work in, is that this idea of make a container the basic object of representation can be related to the idea of make even but that make a representation, that even a representation make it a live object. No, this is one hypothesis. But yet it's a very important observation. This is it's a quality. But I wanted to concentrate on the compositional, if you will, or construction, geometrical construction of the object. But yes, it's very important to know that. No, but many of these objects, ritual and special objects, are containers of liquids because it's only liquids also. Yes, and this has, depending on what author you read, has some relations to have, for instance, an architecture is placed in landscape and its relation to water. No? Or ideas more complex also that has to be put in the table is like the ideas of Esther Pastori or Dean when Dean talks about the culture of stone, or Pastori in her book Thinking with Things refers to the particularity of Inca objects in which, or pre-Columbian Peruvian Inca objects, where she suggests that it's more important the way in which matter is organized than the geometry of the object. That echoes an idea of Jean-Pierre Protzen comparing Inca architecture to Tiahuanaco architecture, because in terms of geometry, Inca architecture is very imprecise. Centimeters are not important, 90-degree angles, not really. The perfect horizontal of a plane, not always. But yes, it's a very synthetic, and it's true that I have erased many labels that could be used to add more understanding of these objects. But
Merci, Paulo.